You can carry on a conversation, but you would honestly prefer not to, and that subtle hesitation gives it away. Your breathing has risen. It is elevated, controlled, and steady. Your legs feel the effort. Yet it is an effort you can maintain for close to an hour without needing to stop or falling apart afterward. That narrow zone of work, harder than a walk but easier than a run, is the only level of intensity where the tiny energy factories inside your cells receive the signal that tells them to multiply. Below this level, they simply maintain their numbers. Above it, they are bypassed entirely. This zone is narrow, and what happens inside those cells at this exact level of effort, only here and not on either side, quietly determines whether your body begins building more of the machinery that produces energy or continues operating with the same gradually declining supply it has been losing since around your 30s. So the underlying question is simple to ask, but surprisingly complex to answer. You already exercise in whatever routine you've settled into, yet those energy factories continue to decline. What actually triggers a cell to create more of them, and why might your current exercise be missing that trigger entirely? Every cell that uses energy contains mitochondria, microscopic structures that convert fuel into usable power. They take glucose and fatty acids and turn them into ADP, the cell's usable energy currency, through a sequence of reactions known as the electron transport chain. Imagine a relay line. Electrons extracted from your food are passed step by step along proteins embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Each transfer releases a small amount of energy, which is used to pump charge across the membrane. This charge builds like water behind a dam, and when it flows back, it drives a molecular turbine that produces ADP. More mitochondria in a cell means more relay lines, more turbines, and a greater capacity to generate the energy every action depends on. The first step in that chain has a specific name because it connects to something you may already recognize. This initial complex accepts electrons from a carrier molecule your body produces from vitamins and relies on for nearly all metabolic processes. That carrier becomes less abundant with age, meaning each mitochondrion gradually produces less energy over time. Keep that in mind because it frames the rest of the story. If each mitochondrion becomes slightly less efficient as this carrier declines, then your total energy output depends greatly on how many mitochondria you have to distribute that loss across. Fewer mitochondria, each working less efficiently, creates a compounding decline. Scientists can even estimate their numbers indirectly. Under an electron microscope, muscle tissue reveals mitochondria as either dense or sparse. Additionally, an enzyme within them, citrate synthase, exists in a consistent ratio to mitochondrial quantity, so measuring its activity in a small muscle sample provides a reliable estimate of how many are present. This is not a guess, but a direct measurement taken from tissue. That capacity is not fixed, and this is where age becomes important. Mitochondrial numbers tend to decrease by about 10% per decade in cross-sectional studies comparing younger and older muscle. However, long-term studies following the same active individuals show a slower decline, suggesting that much of what appears to be aging is actually the result of reduced movement over time. Muscles that continue to demand energy maintain their mitochondria, while those that are used less allow them to fade. The afternoon fatigue, reduced endurance, and slower recovery all partly trace back to having fewer mitochondria, producing less total energy throughout the day. One hidden layer of a fitness plateau exists right here, in a mitochondrial count that steadily declines without you noticing. These structures are decreasing in number. A daily walk helps maintain the mitochondria you already have, keeping them active and functional, but whether it actually signals them to multiply is a different matter. And for most experienced walkers, the answer is subtle but clear. Walking activates many beneficial processes in the body, including boosting signals in the brain that support clearer thinking and help stabilize your mood. It also activates an internal energy sensor within the muscle, essentially a fuel gauge that responds when the cell's energy supply drops, improving how the cell monitors and regulates its resources. It creates a gentle friction as blood flows along vessel walls, which those walls can actually detect, helping them stay flexible and ready to expand quickly when needed. It opens small gateways in the muscle membrane that allow glucose to move from the bloodstream into the muscle fibers to be used for energy, which explains why a walk after eating helps regulate blood sugar so effectively. None of these benefits are minor, and none should be dismissed. For someone just returned to activity after years of inactivity, that walk truly does exceed the threshold required to trigger the creation of new energy-producing structures. In those early months, the feeling of increased lightness and clarity reflects a real, measurable rise in mitochondrial numbers. But then the body does what it always does. It adapts. Over time, that same walk gradually falls below the threshold. Every signal to create new mitochondria passes through a central regulatory protein known as PGC, 1-alpha, which acts like a construction supervisor inside the cell, deciding when existing systems are no longer sufficient and expansion is needed. This supervisor only activates when the cell detects a significant enough energy deficit to indicate that current mitochondria cannot keep up with demand. For an experienced walker whose body is already adjusted, the effort no longer drains energy quickly enough to create that deficit. The demand is easily met, the signal remains weak, and the supervisor stays inactive. The mitochondria simply maintain themselves without increasing in number. There is an ironic twist here. The activity that once delivered the most benefit becomes the very thing the body learns to handle efficiently, and in doing so, removes the need for further growth. So, when a routine walk no longer triggers adaptation, the natural response is to increase intensity, walk faster, climb hills, or push harder. But why wouldn't that solve the problem entirely? When intensity rises too high, such as during sprints, heavy intervals, or intense bursts, the energy demand exceeds what mitochondria can supply in real time. These structures are efficient, but relatively slow. The cell cannot wait for them when immediate energy is required, so it shifts to a rapid backup system called glycolysis. This pathway produces energy quickly but inefficiently, extracting only a small fraction of the potential energy from each glucose molecule compared to what mitochondria could generate under normal conditions. The trade-off is significant. You use far more fuel for short bursts of speed that can only be maintained briefly. It is comparable to burning valuable resources rapidly just to meet urgent demand. This shift can actually be observed through breathing. Scientists measure something called the respiratory exchange ratio, which compares the carbon dioxide you exhale to the oxygen you inhale. Fat metabolism uses more oxygen and produces less carbon dioxide, while rapid sugar metabolism produces more carbon dioxide relative to oxygen. As intensity increases and the body shifts away from mitochondrial energy production toward glycolysis, this ratio rises in a measurable way. You can feel the consequences as well. Lactate begins to accumulate, and a familiar burning sensation in muscles appears as acidity increases beyond what the body can easily manage. In these moments, mitochondria are effectively bypassed because the situation demands immediate energy. As a result, they receive no signal to grow since the emergency system handled the load. This does not make high-intensity effort useless. In fact, it creates important adaptations. The heart becomes stronger, pumping more blood with each beat. The body improves its ability to buffer and tolerate acidity, allowing you to sustain intense efforts longer. Both high-intensity work and the moderate range we are focusing on can activate the cellular construction supervisor, because both create an energy deficit. The key difference lies in how long that deficit is sustained. During high-intensity intervals, the deficit is sharp but brief, is gone within a minute, and with it the energy deficit disappears, while that middle range keeps the same signal active steadily for close to an hour. That sustained, uninterrupted demand is what leads to the greatest increases in mitochondrial density, while the endurance benefits developed from high-intensity effort arise through different mechanisms, as John Holliday demonstrated over decades studying how training reshapes muscle from within. Walking falls below the threshold. Intense effort overshoots it, bypassing the mitochondria and leaving them uninvolved. Somewhere between these two extremes lies a precise zone where the mitochondria are pushed to their limit, yet remain responsible for meeting the demand. So where exactly is this zone? It has a name often mentioned but rarely understood in practice. It sits around 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate. A more accurate definition, grounded in physiology, describes it as the highest effort level where fat remains a primary fuel source and lactate stays low and stable, around 2 millimoles per liter of blood, a threshold carefully mapped by researchers like Inigo Samalon and George Brooks through detailed metabolic testing of fuel usage across intensity levels. Here is the key idea, and it deserves careful attention. At the specific intensity, the mitochondria are operating at full capacity. They are breaking down fatty acids through beta oxidation, cutting long fat chains into smaller units, and feeding them into the central metabolic cycle. At the same time, they are processing glucose through that same cycle at rates near their maximum capability. This cycle is a core engine of the mitochondria, where fuel is fully broken down, and electrons are transferred to produce energy. The demand is high enough that every mitochondrion is fully engaged, yet low enough that the fast emergency system is not required. Fat supplies most of the energy, and the mitochondria carry the entire workload. That balances everything. Imagine a factory operating right at the edge of its maximum output. If it runs at half capacity, no manager would consider building another facility because the current one is underused. If demand suddenly spikes far beyond what it can handle, the work gets outsourced to a faster external system, leaving the factory itself unchanged. But if the factory operates continuously at full capacity, with demand pressing against its limits, the logical decision is to expand, build another factory. That is exactly how the cellular system behaves. The regulatory foreman recognizes this condition, capacity fully used, demand consistently high, and activates the process. Signals travel from the muscle to the cell nucleus, where genetic instructions reside. The mitochondria's own DNA begins replicating, and new mitochondria form as existing ones elongate and divide in a process called fission. Their numbers gradually increase, one division at a time, continuing as long as the effort repeatedly reaches its zone week after week. This entire signaling pathway, from energy deficit to mitochondrial creation, was mapped in foundational research by David Hood, while the detailed molecular signals triggered by exercise were later outlined by John Egan and Jalene Zirith. Consider how precise this window is. Two conditions must exist simultaneously. The demand must be high enough to challenge the mitochondria, yet controlled enough that they remain the primary source of energy. Below this zone, the challenge is insufficient and no signal is sent. Above it, the emergency system takes over, removing the mitochondria from the equation. Only within this narrow range does a signal for growth exist at all. The window is real, and the underlying biology is clear. So, how do you locate this effort level in your own body without access to a lab? Your voice becomes a first tool, and surprisingly, a reliable one. The reason is simple. Speaking clearly requires steady airflow, and as your breathing rate increases with effort, maintaining a smooth, complete sentence becomes more difficult. Begins to compete with your breathing itself. So, the precise moment when finishing a full sentence becomes slightly uncomfortable aligns closely with the point where glycolysis is about to join in. Your breathing, in a sense, is reflecting your metabolism at the correct intensity. You can still speak a complete sentence, but you would rather conserve your breath. You can sustain this effort for 30 minutes to an hour. Your breathing remains deep and rhythmic, never strained or gasping. Someone stuck in a flat, routine walking loop usually stays just below this range. Adding a hill, deliberately increasing pace, or switching to cycling or swimming at that same slightly challenging intensity can lift them into the correct zone. Your heart rate acts as a second tool, though it is less precise than many believe. It generally falls around 60 to 70% of your maximum, but the common formula of subtracting your age from 220 is only a rough estimate, becoming less reliable over time. Your breathing and honest perception of effort provide a far more accurate guide than any fixed number on a machine. If you can talk easily without effort, you are below the zone. If you can complete one sentence but need a breath before starting another, you're near its upper edge, which aligns with findings from Bengt Salton and later work by Christian Lundby examining how oxygen use increases across different intensities. Blood lactate serves as the third and most accurate indicator. When levels remain stable and low, you are truly within the zone. The word steady matters here. Your body constantly produces a small amount of lactate and clears it at the same rate during lower intensities, keeping levels stable. The upper boundary of this zone is where production and clearance are perfectly balanced. Push slightly beyond it, and production exceeds clearance, causing lactate levels to rise. That rise signals the shift toward the fast emergency system and the gradual weakening of the mitochondrial growth signal. Lactate itself is not simply waste. The heart and slower muscle fibers reuse it as fuel, which is why levels remain stable within the zone and only rise when production overwhelms the body's ability to recycle it. The most accurate measurement comes from a small blood sample, but your breathing and speech offer a practical, everyday version of the same insight. Now comes the application. You find the effort, maintain it, and keep the mitochondria working at full capacity without crossing into overload. You repeat the session over days and weeks. What changes begin to appear? At first, nothing dramatic. During the first 2 to 3 weeks, improvements mainly come from enhancing the efficiency of existing mitochondria. The enzymes within them become more effective, allowing each to produce slightly more energy from the same fuel. This improvement happens quickly because it does not require building new structures, only refining what is already there. The early boost you feel is real, but it does not yet reflect an increase in mitochondrial number. Creating new mitochondria takes longer and follows a different process. Noticeable increases typically begin around weeks 4 to 6 because building them is complex. Each mitochondria must replicate its own DNA, produce new proteins, and assemble internal structures before dividing into two through fission. This process cannot be rushed like enzyme production. A meaningful increase in mitochondrial density, visible under a microscope as a denser population within muscle tissue, requires consistent training over 8 to 12 weeks. 2 weeks of effort mainly improves existing function without increasing numbers. Understanding that new mitochondria do not appear until well into the second month is often what prevents people from quitting too early. Many give up around the 3rd week, just before deeper changes begin. Then gradually, the body starts to feel different. Those downstream changes accumulate slowly, then eventually settle into something that feels entirely normal, which is, in its own way, remarkable. Each cell begins producing more energy currency throughout the day. Your tolerance for exertion increases because activities that once push your limited mitochondrial supply to its edge now sit comfortably within a larger reserve. Your ability to use fat as fuel improves as a greater number of mitochondria process fatty acids continuously and efficiently. The afternoon energy drop becomes less pronounced, and there is a quiet elegance in the underlying arithmetic. That declining shuttle molecule introduced at the beginning, the one that gradually reduces the efficiency of each individual mitochondrion with age, becomes less significant when the total number of mitochondria increases. A larger population compensates for reduced efficiency at the individual level, maintaining overall energy output. In this way, increasing mitochondrial number becomes one of the body's indirect responses to a decline it cannot fully reverse. The total volume of oxygen your body can utilize at peak effort also rises. The network of tiny blood vessels supplying the muscle becomes denser, improving delivery of oxygen and nutrients to where they are needed. This denser capillary network shortens the distance oxygen must travel from the bloodstream to each mitochondrion. More mitochondria supported by more capillaries creates a tighter, more efficient delivery system. Everything in the supply chain adapts together. And this is where a long-standing plateau finally begins to break. A fitness ceiling that seemed fixed despite consistent walking was never actually a true limit. It was sitting on top of an energy system that had quietly stopped expanding. Walking maintained the surface, but it could not raise the ceiling because the ceiling is determined by total cellular energy capacity, which depends on mitochondrial number. When that foundation expands, the ceiling rises with it. What felt like a hard stop was actually the top of a shrinking base. There is an important boundary here that should be stated clearly. This moderate intensity zone expands energy production capacity, but it does not significantly stimulate a separate system, muscle hypertrophy. Building muscle size requires mechanical tension, a high load that physically strains muscle fibers. That strain activates a different regulatory pathway, governed by a different foreman, responsible for increasing contractile proteins rather than energy-producing structures. This system responds only to force, not sustained metabolic demand. The endurance zone and the strength-building zone operate independently. One improves energy supply, The other increases a machinery that uses that energy. They do not substitute for each other because they respond to fundamentally different stimuli. A complete approach to physical adaptation therefore requires both endurance work to increase mitochondrial capacity and resistance training to increase muscle mass and strength. One expands the engine, the other strengthens the frame that carries it. Without resistance work, it is possible to develop a body that produces more energy but gradually loses the muscle needed to use that energy effectively. The plateau breaks not because walking alone is insufficient, but because walking alone was never designed to expand the underlying energy capacity. In practice, this is where the adjustment happens. The steady walks remain, but the true mitochondrial building work shifts into that moderate, slightly uncomfortable intensity zone. Walking becomes a foundation rather than the primary driver of adaptation. At this level, you can still hold a conversation, but you would prefer not to. Breathing is elevated yet controlled. The legs are working, but the effort remains sustainable. This is a narrow range where mitochondria operate near their maximum oxidative capacity while still serving as the primary energy source. Below it, they are underchallenged. Above it, they are bypassed. Within this zone, the cellular foreman detects that mitochondrial capacity is fully engaged and that demand consistently meets the ceiling. That signal activates genetic programs that begin producing new mitochondria. The population gradually increases, and the energy-producing infrastructure that has been declining since around age 30 begins to rebuild within the very cells that rely on it most. The walk builds a base. This intensity expands it, and the mitochondria were never absent in their ability to grow. They were simply waiting for the conditions that made growth necessary.